If it isn't the spectacular spider smut!
Oh, dude, pants! No one wants to see your junk.
Keep laughing, punk! See what I found? What do you think happens if I use it?
Interest rates go down?
Yes. It's like my powers are totally unleashed. Now I can absorb all this energy. Energy without limit!
And yet, still no pants.
I have become a being of pure energy! Without pants!
Hello everyone! We continue with our journey of ranking all Spider-Man games using my Stasucritic scoring system. You can read more about it in the pinned comment. There is not much to say in the introduction for this part. At this moment in time there would still be no Spider-Man movie on the horizon. It was assumed that Spider-Man 4 would appear in 2011, but as everyone knows by now, didn't work out. But let's see what Spider-Man games have been up to in this period of time. Spider-Man Toxic City by Gameloft is a good example why I love checking out old Java-based titles that so many people nowadays tend to ignore, because this is quite frankly a hidden gem. Now, it should be noted that Toxic City has two main versions, a fully 2D one and another version that has 2D character sprites but is in 3D environments. We're talking about the fully 2D one. And even this version has many different variants. You can get a game like you see on the screen now, or on the opposite end of the spectrum, a very dumbed down version for a phone with a small screen and little memory. Usually I would separate such cases into various entries because they do provide different gameplay and narrative experience, but there are so many variations of how much any particular version is cut down that it's quite frankly a pain to find them all. They're all based one way or another on the fullest version of the game anyway, which, for the purposes of simplicity, is the sole variant we're going to discuss. Toxic City is a brawler set in the Ultimate Universe, and it handles the controls exceptionally elegantly for button-based phones. You have only one attack button, but after initiating a combo, pressing various directional buttons will trigger different hits that allow you to juggle enemies, jump back down into the fray after, hit from the left or the right direction, and so on. There is also slight magnetism at work here that makes sure you won't miss enemies if you don't fully align, and if there's nobody near you, then the attack button acts as a web grab. This creates gameplay where at the core it's just inherently enjoyable to beat up bad guys. The controls are pretty responsive as well, although there are some issues with quick time events where the game doesn't always recognize input unless you mash the button. Switching also can be a bit finicky, but you usually notice that only in the bonus levels where you have to fly around collecting spider points you use for upgrades. Another flaw that the game has is that pretty much every boss is recycled 2 times, and you get to fight Rhino actually 3 times. That can get a bit tiring, especially considering that even though each boss has their own moveset, at the end of the day fights with them are about avoiding their attack patterns until you get dazed so you could get some hits in. Character upgrades do soften the blow as every time you defeat the boss faster. And the basic enemy variety is not particularly big either. There is a bit of variance in how some mooks use ranged weapons or grenades or explode upon dying, but at their core they're the same archetype with different skins. However, it's so enjoyable to beat them around that it never feels like a problem, especially considering how the game is really good at pacing itself. There is lots of variety across the levels. You go from handling Rhino's mayhem on the streets, to fighting Goblin who's attacking your school, to chasing Vulture across rooftops, to saving hostages at the bank robbery set up by Dr. Octavius, to riding a scooter as Mary Jane as she hurries to help Peter. Which leads us to the story. I was very surprised at the quality of the storytelling. And I don't mean the narrative itself. It is enjoyable with a lot of charm and writing, but ultimately nothing special. What I mean is how the story is actually presented and told. Java games usually tend to be very light in that aspect to save space. Toxic City though goes all out with proper setups, a little bit of relationship tension between Peter and Mary Jane, Miguel and Jameson getting into focus quite a bit to contextualize robotic enemies that hunt both the supervillains and Spider-Man himself, Aunt May is worried about Peter. It feels like a properly told episode within the Ultimate Universe with its own progression and resolution. And it helps that the writing makes it quite enjoyable too, though there are some handwaves that are better ignored, like how the hell did Aunt May not hear anything about Rhino stomping through Daily Bugle where Peter was supposedly working overtime, or how did the supervillains manage to escape from Triskelion several times across this game. And to tie everything up together, finding 2/3 of the hidden collectibles will unlock a special post-credits ending. In terms of other gameplay bonuses, there's the black suit skin, various modes like time attack and survival, achievements. This is a full, enjoyable brawler package, and I will assign a Stasocritic rating of 77. Spider-Man Toxic City is just a very good game. It has some flaws, definitely, but the core mechanics are great, the structure is solid, the story is enjoyable, the replayability factor is present. What more could one ask? I had lots of fun, so I would absolutely recommend it. This is the second main version of Toxic City made by Gameloft, and there are at least 2 variants of it as well, one for touchscreen devices and one for button ones. I would recommend the button variation here because the controls of Toxic City are more well suited for playing with one hand, while when using touchscreen it is certainly playable but can be a bit weird at times. At any rate, while this may look like the 2D Toxic City but with 3D backgrounds, there are actually considerable differences in terms of level design and the amount of enemy archetypes. For example, if in the Java version you chase Vulture across rooftops, here you do so while jumping from a school bus to school bus and fighting criminals on the way. And speaking of criminals, while there are more archetypes, the way they're designed doesn't quite suit the mechanics, as they presume the existence of dodging or blocking that are not present. Some, like the motorcycle riders, require precise jump and kick movements, which again is not what existing mechanics are built for. There's also a weird thing that plenty of enemies seem to have larger reach than you do, again introducing some annoyances into the gameplay. Surprisingly enough, even though this version is made for more powerful phones, the story actually has been quite truncated, with a lot of really nice character moments missing. It's still fine and there's still quite a lot of good writing, but it's not as enjoyable, as is the entire game, I guess. I will assign a Stasocritic rating of 65. It's certainly a nice title and it's pretty fun, but it's clunkier and not as well structured as its 2D counterpart. Another mobile title by Gameloft, and it feels like a fully 3D reimagining of Toxic City. It doesn't use absolutely the same premise, but a lot of villains and writing related to them is repurposed. And it's one of those games which does nothing particularly wrong, but there's also nothing standing out either. For example, the fighting mechanics are pretty nice and you can do some cool combos, but the enemy variety is very small, and combine that with pretty large health even when you upgrade Spidey's damage, and you get a lot of prolonged combat situations that get boring. Likewise with the bosses, there's some variety, but they're also lacking depth in comparison to the amount of health they have, so those start feeling like a chore as well. I will assign a Stasocritic rating of 47 to Total Mayhem. The game is certainly functional and is more enjoyable than many other Spider-Man games out there, but there's nothing particularly special or exciting about it. Shattered Dimensions, developed by Beanox, is not the first time a crossover between multiple Spider-Man happened, however it's pretty much the one that has propelled the concept into mainstream popularity. As much as physics-based web swinging provides unique navigation opportunities for open-world environments, I appreciate Shattered Dimensions for going towards a more classic divided by levels approach with animation-based swinging that's not even that core of a mechanic. It proves that a Spider-Man game doesn't need to have an open world to be great, and Shattered Dimensions certainly is. I even regret not playing it back in 2010, it's just a really fun game. In many ways it reminds me of Neversoft's 2000 title because of how much it cares about the character and just oozes personality. The game also has Stan Lee narrating the experience. All 4 Spider-Man are voiced by people who played the character in various animated series in the past. There's tons of references and Easter eggs for fans of all the featured universes: Amazing, Ultimate, 2099 and Noir. The story isn't anything special really. Mysterio found a magic tablet that gives special powers to the person holding it, tablet broke, reality is in danger, 4 different Spider-Men have to retake tablet pieces from villains that found them. The missions for Noir and 2099 Spider-Man actually form some little progressive narrative arcs of their own, but every level of Amazing and Ultimate Spider-Man feels standalone and not connected to the rest of the experience. The simplicity of the tale is balanced out by some incredibly engaging writing.
And now, scale the wall with your unique adhesive abilities.
I believe the technical term is stickum powers.
And you can run across narrow walkways such as this one without fear of falling, due to your natural agility and powers of adhesion.
They're called stickum powers. Did one of the other me's make that joke already?
Yes, and it was no funnier then.
Yeesh.
Where are you going?
Me? I gotta put something together for when he gets past you guys. Not that I don't have faith in you, but I don't.
Welcome to the Shadow Division, Spider-Man. Tomorrow's weapons developed today. And at the heart of it all, my masterpiece. Impressive, isn't it?
Eh,
What do you mean, meh?
I've seen one of these before.
No, you haven't.
I have, I totally have.
It's a condensed matter reactor, the only one in existence.
Is that what it is? Oh. Eh.
Incidentally, this is the first console Spider-Man game with proper subtitle support for cutscenes and important gameplay dialogue. Took some time, to be honest. Anyway, this is besides the point. Even though every Spider-Man shares the same core gameplay mechanics related to combat and navigation, as well as some sort of kyphosis, I mean, seriously, that posture is definitely not healthy. Every world stands out in both visual and gameplay style. The brightly colored, in the vein of the 60s comic books Amazing Spider-Man, has a heavier focus on platforming and navigational challenges with some combat mixed in. It's a traditional gameplay approach, which fits the most traditional Spider-Man of them all. The sleek, modern-looking Ultimate Spider-Man is a bit hack-and-slashy, with tons of enemies attacking that the character can take care of with a symbiote-induced rage mode, dealing massive amounts of damage to such a big number of opponents. Spider-Man 2099 is all about speed. In this neon-colored world, fights are fast, enemies are quick, there's barely any cooldown between one action section or another. Unique gameplay for this character is a freefall mode where you need to avoid obstacles, and you can always manage your speed with a special slow-mo power. And finally, the most intriguing one of them all is Spider-Man Noir, who can take a beating, but not a bullet, therefore he must stay in the shadows of his mostly stealth-focused and very desaturated levels. The variety in styles is very important because it allows to balance out the somewhat limited gameplay vocabulary. For example, most of the game you'll face the same 5 main enemy archetypes: Standard Mook, Mook with a melee weapon, Mook with a ranged weapon, Big Mook, and a very big Mook. There are a bit more, sometimes you'll see enemies with shields, and within the existing archetypes, thanks to different worlds and levels, there's some variety as well, like sand monsters who have to be soaked with water first, but the overall lack of archetypes is something you do notice after a while. The combat system is certainly very well done and snappy. I even don't mind the defensive stance on trigger, which allows you to dodge normal hits as long as you hold it, because unlike Spider-Man 3, it doesn't slow down time, so it feels more natural. There's a bunch of really fun twists on mechanics previously implemented in other Spider-Man games. For example, the web strike here is very similar to the one found in Web of Shadows, but instead of having to break off when someone tries to counter, you press the jump button to vault over and continue your attack combo to keep the flow of the fight going in your favor. Though sadly, there's also some mechanics that break the flow. For example, after you purchase the disarm skill, whenever you shoot a web at an enemy with the gun, unless you do it from air, you will stop in place to participate in a quick tap and minigame where you have to yank away the weapon. That doesn't feel great at all, though you get used to it in time. All characters have the same combos, most of which you have to purchase in the upgrade screen, however, their speed and animation style differs greatly. Amazing Spider-Man goes really crazy with his webs, for example, while Spider-Man Noir combat style is very bone-breaking, let's say, and crunchy. Though I suppose every Spider-Man sooner or later gets into a very crunchy style of combat in the first-person segments where you bare-knuckle with the level's boss. Another gameplay ingredient that you're gonna see very often is having to save civilians to bring them to a certain point so they'd open something. Or in the case of Spider-Man Noir, saving hostages to then bring them to a safe spot. The game has 14 levels, but within them this goal is used so often that by the end you might roll your eyes when you see another set of civilians. While stuff like this does get old as a standalone ingredient, Shattered Dimensions does a fantastic job at repurposing all that to create absolutely unique levels, even for Spider-Man Noir and 2099, who don't change locations as much as Amazing and Ultimate do. For example, the third Noir level takes place in an abandoned amusement park where fireworks every so often will light up the environments, drastically decreasing the amount of shadows. You even don't really care much if there is no detailed stealth mechanics like ways to distract enemies or gadgets of any kind, because the ability to do a stealth takedown from absolutely any position is enough, and the action is relatively fast-paced in comparison to traditional stealth gameplay. The first Amazing Spider-Man level against Kraven is focused on stuff like traps, snipers, avoiding Kraven's rifle while fighting with groups of enemies, and it's an absolutely different beast from the second Amazing Spider-Man level, where you have to web-zip from object to object amid sandstorms, throw water barrels, and so on. One of the levels for Ultimate Spider-Man is an incredibly chaotic zombie-like infestation caused by carnage. There's so much stuff going on, it's crazy. Absolutely every level is a blast, though sometimes they still manage to drag out a bit. For example, one of the other Ultimate Spider-Man levels takes place on an oil rig, and it's very big and open environment. However, after you destroy 2 sets of Deadpool's cameras and then have the first fight with him, you have to go to another oil rig with another 2 sets of cameras. But stuff like this is more of a sad exception to the overall very tightly paced missions. And it is appreciated how absolutely every level from beginning to end is focused on a single villain. Makes it very satisfying to take them out in the end. Most of the time you fight the level's opponent more than once, they change or upgrade their tactics between battles, and really there is not a single boss that's exactly the same. Except the weird face-to-face parts, but they still work as space breakers. Shattered Dimensions, besides the traditional point-based ranking system for every level, also has a very nice challenge system. A number of achievements specific for every mission for which you get upgrade points that you can use to purchase new moves, improve stats, or get alternative suits for your characters. Not every challenge is visible from the get-go, though even invisible ones are still getting tracked, so your mind is not overwhelmed from the get-go by everything you might have to do. At the time of writing this, I got 135 out of 180 challenges, and I'm seriously considering going back and getting the rest because the levels are just so great and the core gameplay is extremely enjoyable despite some of its flaws and occasional glitches. Spider-Man Shattered Dimensions is getting a Stasocritic rating of 90. I think it is an exceptionally underrated and underappreciated title, and that's coming from a person who has zero nostalgic reverence for it. I never played the game until I had to rank it for the video. Okay, well, I vaguely remember playing a demo version that had a noir segment, but that's about it. Is the game perfect? No, there are some flaws, and as much as it tries to play around the repetitive nature of used gameplay ingredients, some repetitiveness still exists. but goddamn is it extremely enjoyable, insanely creative, every level is a marvel, pun not intended, animations are bonkers, it is stylistically fantastic, for the most part very tightly paced, and most importantly, it feels very true to the character. Perhaps after Spider-Man 2 has reimagined what a Spider-Man game can be, people now expect other titles to follow those footsteps and improve upon that. This leaves a much more traditional game like Shattered Dimensions in a weird position where it is perhaps not a Spider-Man game that people expect. But that doesn't make it any less fantastic. If Web of Shadows was the last console PC Spider-Man game I played back in the day, the DS Shattered Dimensions is the last handheld entry I played back then. I have very fond memories of this title by gripped in games, but also after playing Web of Shadows for DS, I was wondering if maybe my memories were somewhat rose-tinted. It turns out though that Shattered Dimensions is really just absolutely better in every way than Web of Shadows. The combat has been greatly improved. Not only are the actual mechanics tighter, but also since there is no suit switching, all abilities you find are always available to you, which means you can do some very creative combo chains. Dodge is snappier mechanically, and also enemy attack windups are far easier to notice this time around. Shattered Dimensions doesn't send tons of random enemies at you, in fact you'll rarely see more than 4 opponents at a time, which creates much more manageable situations than what Web of Shadows did. Bosses are also improved, being actual characters from Spidey's Rogue Gallery rather than random symbiotes. It's worth pointing out that you will fight different bosses here than in the console version, which works well from the perspective of this being an alternative version of the premise. The bosses themselves are hit and miss, there are some really fun examples like the Boomerang, but also some more boring ones like the Tinkerer, who's more about arena fighting with standard enemies, but at least there's enough variance. Speaking of premise, the DS version of Shattered Dimensions has 3 universes instead of 4. The reason is quite clear. Every character at the end has the same toolkit, so the differences come from what abilities are missing at the beginning. For example, Noir Spider-Man can't wall crawl, while Amazing Spider-Man can glide, and so on. This is what defines various exploration challenges when you start. The map system is much more comfortable than in Web of Shadows, making it far easier to see which locations you have visited, which you have not, and where there might be an item that you didn't yet pick up. However, should you need some challenge or leeway, Shattered Dimensions has combat and exploration difficulty levels customizable separately. Exploration in general does have more meaning in this game than Web of Shadows, since skills aren't purchased with experience points but are actually found in the world. The only poor part of this whole loop is that to switch dimensions you have to complete an annoying minigame that becomes longer the farther you progress in the game. I swear my theory that somebody somewhere had a mandate to put in at least one touchscreen minigame on the DS becomes more and more likely, as it's the only one you will find. Luckily, it's absent from alternative game modes that you unlock after completing the story. Shattered Dimensions is a pretty short game, even when you have a goal to find all optional power-ups. But unlike Web of Shadows, which tried to extend playtime through unfair means like a massive amount of enemies sent at you, Shattered Dimensions focuses on replayability. Things like achievements that unlock challenges, which put at the forefront the mastery of navigational and combat systems, and improving your skills there will make it easier to complete additional modes like Time Trial and Arcade. And look, even though the game provides a complete, easily replayable package, it also is not perfect. Outside of some bosses being disappointing, there are things like lack of interesting ways to find bonus upgrades. Yeah, there are some cases of the Sonic Dash being used quite creatively, but most of the time there is a single little chamber that you can access after gaining a new ability. And even within the main campaign path, there's not a lot of interesting uses of core character abilities. So from the perspective of this being a Metroidvania title, it might be a bit more on the simplistic side, but it's still good and the combat system is just insanely satisfying. Shattered Dimensions has absolutely exemplary core systems, so it will get a Stasicritic rating of 82. It's a really great game, you will definitely have a lot of fun if the styles to your liking, and so far it has set a new standard of quality for handheld Spider-Man titles. It's an experience one shouldn't miss out on. Shattered Dimensions is a very difficult game to follow up. It's especially difficult to follow up with a title released in a year, which realistically means about 7 months of production time, and potentially likely understaffed because in parallel Binex had a much larger and more important project going. But Edge of Time is not just a worse version of Shattered Dimensions. It sadly is an absolute disappointment. The core mechanics are mostly the same, which means they're inherently fun, even though there's less combos than in Shattered Dimensions, and too many actions are tied to the special power meter, which in case of special moves has to be overloaded. But look, all these gameplay intricacies largely don't matter because Edge of Time is very boring. Instead of going wild with the dimensions and universes, Edge of Time focuses on two Spider-Man, 2099 from the future and Amazing from the now alternative present timeline. They are for some reason voiced by the Noir and Ultimate actors from the previous game, which is strange, but the acting is still really good, so I can't really complain there. The interaction between these two, as each tries to deal in parallel with the stuff going on in their timelines, is the most enjoyable thing about the game, and it's pretty fun how actions in one dimension affect the other, though it should be noted that while it was marketed as a gameplay mechanic, it's more of a narrative one than anything.
O'Hara, there's nothing left here in the trash. You still there?
For the most part.
Did they turn into something else? Like, I don't know, kittens?
Yeah. Small, metal, robotic, killer kittens.
Aww.
The rest is fine on a technical level, but just in terms of pacing, variety and structure, it is incredibly boring. The visual style is unified between the two time periods, and the whole game takes place in the Alchemax building, which is a big next-gen brown mush in the present and an even bigger next-gen grey mush in the future. Environments, enemies, interactable objects all blend in together and every room looks the same. And you will have to unlock most of these rooms with keys that you find by defeating enemies. I'm not kidding, you'll go through one locked door to find another locked door that requires a key from an enemy, or 3. Sometimes there are little set pieces and they're fine, but also there is a lot of boring vent crawling where you just push forward and wait, and wait. But most disappointing is how practically every combat encounter is just waves of the same enemies sent at you over and over again. There is practically zero variety or sense of pace, so even though the mechanics are good, you just get tired. Edge of Time absolutely fails to liven things up the way Shattered Dimensions does. And look, it's not like Shattered Dimensions didn't reuse a lot of the same gameplay ingredients, we've discussed as much in its entry, but it's always been recontextualized with a different obstacle type, style of level, things happening in the environments, so it always felt different enough. In Edge of Time, however, you're literally doing the same thing all the time. The new implementation of the challenges web is also disappointing. Edge of Time is one continuous adventure, so challenges now are all pretty much restricted to certain rooms with a gold, silver and bronze medal attached to your performance. To track it, you always have to manually activate the challenge, and most of these challenges are the same. There is not as much variety as there is in Shattered Dimensions. At least there is the benefit of being able to replay them at any point from the challenge menu. In the end, I will assign a Stasicritic rating of 35. Edge of Time might not be a bad game, but it certainly is disappointing. The character writing is pretty good and there's some nice story twists, which might be enough to motivate you to go through the entire game. Though overall the narrative mostly hinges on the enjoyment of Spider-Man dialogues, and those weren't enough to prevent my boredom. the Wii and 3DS ports of Edge of Time have some gameplay differences that honestly I don't think are sufficient enough to warrant a separate entry. Yeah, some challenges are a bit different, some skills are absent, but by and large, this is the same game. However, the reason why I don't put these versions into the same pile is because of how the game looks. And it's not just about having lower graphical fidelity. If it'll be just a port with downgraded graphics, I wouldn't separate it into a different entry either. But the thing is, these ports not only have lower graphical fidelity, but also more contrast and color. The PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 versions of Edge of Time for the most part blur everything into a brown or grey mess, depending on whether you're in the past or the future. While here, even though the main color gamma is still the same, there is enough variance and contrast to make you actually able to see and discern what is going on. And notice your enemies in the background, which on the bigger consoles at times can be practically impossible. So this version will get a Statocritic rating of 40. For me, it's still a pretty boring game, but at least it's not as boring to look at. The stylistic difference is pretty big, making these ports more favorable to play. Edge of Time for the DS, developed by Other Ocean, was clearly inspired by Shattered Dimensions in terms of overall gameplay style, and it has some interesting concepts of its own. For example, you can switch between dimensions at any time to do things like opening up a path in the present so the future Spider-Man could find out the solution to a puzzle that the present Spider-Man requires solving. So, conceptually, the game is certainly interesting. In terms of implementation though, the combat and navigation are far less precise and fluid than Shattered Dimensions, and it's difficult to stay in the state of flow. The mechanics of different dimensions affecting each other are not really used up to full potential. But more than that, it's just kinda boring, with a confusing and not that satisfying level design spread across the entire game. With great regret, I have to assign a Statocritic rating of 37. The game is conceptually more interesting than the console Edge of Time, and at least you don't stay in exactly the same building throughout the duration of the entire story, but still, it's not a title that I enjoyed experiencing despite the interesting ideas. This era of Spider-Man games between the movies is probably the most underrepresented one. Many remember and talk about Web of Shadows because Spider-Man 3 was still fresh in people's minds, but the titles between Web of Shadows and Amazing Spider-Man are largely ignored, and I must say, quite unfairly. This period has seen a mobile Java game that as an overall experience is higher quality than every other handheld Spider-Man title released previously. Then Shattered Dimensions for DS has raised the bar for handheld games quality in general, while the console and PC Shattered Dimensions is a forgotten gem, an absolutely fantastic game that for some reason isn't remembered as often as it should. Maybe because it's not open world, I don't know, but at any rate it deserves more recognition. Edge of Time has been disappointing all around, sadly, but at least we got some really great games. And in the next video, we'll find out if Amazing Spider-Man movie tie-ins can provide some great experiences as well.